Hello and welcome to the Choralosophy Podcast. This is episode 210, Jazz and Theory in the Choral Classroom with David von Kampen. Should jazz join other forms of ensemble singing in the, quote, mainstream of music education? Or does it best fit kind of where it is now, within a niche? In our second episode of the brand new GIA Walton series on choralosophy, I am excited to bring you another fascinating and useful conversation. This time with composer and vocal jazz advocate David von Kampen. In this discussion, we tackle teaching approaches and programming philosophies that seek to seamlessly weave concepts from jazz and music theory into our choral classrooms of all levels. It can be true for many teachers that we program jazz less because we either don't have a dedicated jazz ensemble at our programs, or we just didn't receive much education in our teacher training programs that help us feel comfortable approaching the repertoire. This insecurity can often manifest itself as a programming gap. When you sing jazz, nothing about the fundamentals of healthy singing changes, David will say later in this episode. David also advocates for all schools having a dedicated vocal jazz ensemble in their program, but also offers practical ways to inject jazz into the curriculum in general choral environments. So tune in, have your thinking about your own program stimulated and challenged, and then of course weigh in yourself with your related ideas and experiences on Facebook in the Choralosophers group or over on Substack at choralosophy.substack.com, which is a free resource of blogs and other conversations related to the topics you hear about on the show. Calling all concert planners. Let's talk about Ludus. It's more than just a ticketing platform. It's a game changer for event management. Picture this: simplified ticketing, seamless marketing, powerful fundraising, and now, brand new this year, volunteer management. All for free to you and your organization. Thousands of organizations trust Ludus, and you should too. Elevate your events with Ludus. Sign up at ludus.com/choralosophy today and experience the difference. Don't forget, it pays to listen to this show if you are a music educator. The list of discounts and benefits for listeners just keeps growing, so your checklist for back to school means getting your sheet music at graphitepublishing.com or endeavormusicpublishing.com, sight reading materials from sightreadingfactory.com along with your student memberships every time you renew, acquire folders and other classroom materials from mymusicfolders.com, and now, most recently, your sub-plans, your ready-made activities and assessments related to music theory can be generated for you with your 3minutetheory.com membership. All of these great vendors accept the Choralosophy discount code. When you check out, you're going to get money saved for your program that helps you take your school year farther. So make sure you hit all of those websites, and it supports this show. The content on the Choralosophy podcast is free. One of the ways that I make that happen is by asking for your help. If you can support the show on Patreon or on Substack, I appreciate it, and it really does make this whole thing work. Quick shout out to everyone on the Patreon at the producer level or higher: Brian Long, Venture Studios, Jonah Clicksbull, Angie Schilling, David Kowalczyk, Kyle Peterson, Max Jackson, Michael Herron, Ryan Main, Stephen Kathy Kakachik. All right, everybody, I am here with David von Kampen, or as he is known in the hip-hop community, DVK. We're going to be talking about jazz education, music theory education, and a variety of other things that I think choral music educators need to know more about and talk more about. So, David, welcome.
It is terrific to be here, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Now, I just made up the hip-hop thing accidentally. That's not true, right?
DVK started with one of my first classes of students at UNL in the music theory department. And I don't know, I did not ask for that. They just started saying it. I think it's because I sign off emails with it the way professors do sometimes with their initials. It's less of a mouthful than my full name. So.
Oh, I see. Okay, so my story's cooler, and you're welcome to continue to use that into the future.
I might try that at some point. We'll see. I don't know if I can sell it the way you did.
I get that all the time. I have this way of saying things so deadpan that people just assume it's true. So I wanted to make sure that I corrected the record there.
I bought it. I was believing it for a second.
That's great. Well, why don't you tell us some real true things about who you are and what you do every day?
Yeah. I'm a composer from Lincoln, Nebraska. Originally from the Detroit area in childhood, and then family moved out here and got my degrees at University of Nebraska, where I teach now, and went down to Lawrence, Kansas to do my doctorate in composition, and then made our way back up here. I am on faculty at the Glenn Korff School of Music at UNL. I teach music theory, ear training. I direct the Jazz Singers Vocal Jazz Ensemble. I teach a freshman honors seminar on listening to pop music, and then kind of whatever else they need me to teach. I'm kind of a rover in the department, but a lot of teaching and a lot of composing. I write a lot for choirs and arrange jazz music and all sorts of different things. And then I'm a part-time church musician. I direct some church choirs on the side as well.
Very cool. Very cool. And I've done several of your choral compositions in over
Oh,
my years, and I think there's some beautiful work that you do. Most recently, Marcus Garrett was in Kansas City doing our Choral Institute and did your Saturn's Embrace,
oh,
which fun fact here was my daughter sang in that choir, and that was her favorite piece on the
oh, that
program.
makes me so happy. I'm so glad to hear that.
Yeah, she loved it, and I had the opportunity, and I don't want to assume that this is true again, but I had an opportunity to work in that sectional or it was helping Marcus with sectionals on that piece,
Mhm.
and I noticed what seemed to be a little bit of jazz theory going on in that piece of music. Is that correct?
I think when jazz harmony is in your life, it seeps into every single thing you do. So yes, my uh, traditional choral music, whatever that term is worth, I think there's a lot of bleed through from my love for jazz harmony. Do you think people know the story of that piece? Because I would love to just say where Saturn's Embrace comes from.
Sure, go for it.
Uh, Saturn's Embrace is based on a text that was sent out as a tweet back when Twitter had tweets from an account called Limericking, and they made up extremely clever limericks about events of the day. And usually they're kind of off color or about politics or whatever. But this one was very earnest about the spacecraft Cassini, which went to Saturn, and the whole point of this space journey was that it was going to crash itself into Saturn because it was near the end of its life, and the photographers at NASA said, "All right, this thing is gonna float away and be no use to us. So let's crash it into Saturn and get as many pictures as we possibly can at the last moment." And Limericking wrote this beautiful, sad little poem about Cassini was sent into space and descending in fire, and just very evocative language. And the owner of that Twitter account gave me permission to set the text several years ago now, and it's one of my very favorite things I've written.
Yeah, that's very cool. And I started with that anecdote because I wanted to talk with you a little bit about your beliefs and your passion for jazz writing and jazz in general, and incorporating jazz into the choral language, so to speak, into our choral vernacular. Where did that interest of yours come from? What was that inspiration in your life to think of yourself as a vocal jazzer or jazzer?
Yeah. The jazz in my life goes back a long way, sort of. When I was in grade school, I got really into kind of moving away from what I was supposed to be doing in my piano lessons, and I got much more interested in playing by ear and trying to learn songs that I liked. And the music in our house was, I would say, mostly pop music and folk music, but my parents had a lot of CDs by groups that utilized jazz harmony without really calling themselves jazz. So there are like songs by Art Garfunkel that I heard a million times that have what we might call jazz chords in them, even though no one would consider Art Garfunkel to be a jazz artist. Same thing with bands like Toto and Billy Joel. These artists are using harmony that comes from jazz, and I was really excited about that without really knowing what it was. And when I got to college and started playing in jazz ensembles, then I got more exposed to what we might consider to be kind of traditional jazz, or what people normally think of as jazz artists, but a lot of big band music. And then discovering vocal jazz was just this really lovely intersection of that with my love for choral music. And I enjoy kind of small group instrumental jazz that's really focused on virtuosity and improvisation, but that's not really where I live at all. My experience with jazz and really my love for jazz comes from the harmonies and the complexity of the harmonies, and specifically when they're sung. I think vocal jazz is really special in that way, because we don't often hear the human voice combining to make these really crunchy, dissonant sounds. Certainly that exists in some traditional choral music, but in jazz, you get it all the time, a steady diet. And besides being super fun, just as its own thing, it's also a fantastic ear training opportunity for singers. When singers are exposed to singing the vernacular jazz language vertically, it really forces your ear to do things that we don't often ask singers to do.
Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting, and I agree. And I'm going to throw out a intentionally dumb statement so that it's a softball that you can respond to. I teach in a choir program that doesn't have a jazz choir, so I can't do jazz. Correct?
Yeah, incorrect, my friend.
Okay.
So there are a handful of ways that I would like to respond to that, and one of them is just going to sort of undercut the whole premise of the question, which is you should be starting vocal jazz at your school. I think it is not as difficult to do as some people think. I know a lot of choral directors who come out of a choral background who do not have jazz training, who decide to make a decisive effort in this because of the incredible benefits it has for students' musicianship. I think a lot of choral directors have invested time and energy in getting better at things that aren't really part of choral music, like choreography or putting on a musical. That's not necessarily what you're trained to do as a choral music ed major, and yet a lot of choir directors pursue those things and get better at them. I would say approaching the jazz language and jazz style and jazz harmony is exactly the same thing. It's adjacent to what you're already doing, and once you start doing it, there are it's kind of like an onion. There's a lot of layers, but they peel back real easy, and you're gonna learn to love the process of kind of digging into that. With that said, if you're not going to start an actual vocal jazz ensemble of 12 voices on microphones or whatever, you can absolutely approach some kind of gentle ways into jazz harmony with a traditional chamber choir or even a concert choir. It's all about finding the literature that kind of sits in between traditional choral music and vocal jazz. And gosh, I wouldn't even know where to go from there. We could talk about that a lot more. Does that sort of answer your question?
No, it does, and I think in kind of the larger choral programs in high schools around, especially in the Midwest, because this is kind of where it's not uncommon to have choir programs where the smallest class is 35, 40. And I think that's where the challenge would be in a lot of those programs to get the administrative support to say, I would like you to pay a teacher to teach this class of 12 kids. When they're going to look at my numbers in all my other classes, and they're just going to say it's a flat no. You're not going to get that kind of support, which is why my question was intentionally dumb, but wanting to thread that needle of if the reality is not going to be that we're going to get administrative support for a class of 12 kids, what is the best way, in your opinion, to expose my largest choir is 100. Yeah. How do I get them to be exposed? That's going to be their only opportunity probably for most of them to be exposed to any type of vocal music at all in their education. How do I sneak jazz in there? What would be your response there?
2 words: unaccompanied ballads. You are not beholden to a rhythm section. You don't need to put anyone on microphones. You can approach it basically like any other slow, pretty, unaccompanied piece you would normally give that choir. But the harmonies are just going to have a little more juice, a little more crunch in them, and that allows you to spend time talking about things like, all right, look, we have a half step between these 2 voices. How do we want that to sound? I find when I clinic groups, either traditional choirs, big choirs, small choirs, jazz choirs, so often when a group of voices is supposed to be singing a chord that has a half step or a minor ninth or a major seventh in it, these crunchy dissonant harmonies, the singers don't even realize that they are afraid of those sounds. When I isolate that, first of all, they're not singing it correctly. They're not singing the half step in tune. Then I get them to sing it in tune, and every single one of their faces goes, "Ugh, I don't like the way that sounds." Well, you have to love the way that sounds, because you can't get, I don't know if you'll be able to hear this on my microphone or not, but a chord like this, F, C, D flat, D flat. Like, that's just one example, right? Major seven in inverted and spread out a little bit. If that half step, that ugly dissonant half step in the middle there, is not being sung so well that it is being enjoyed, the crunch and the dissonance of that, if the singers are not identifying that and enjoying the way it sounds, the beauty of that fuller chord is not going to come through. And so jazz teaches us to do that. When you have that harmonic language where so many of these chords have that crunch to them, you can really force them to think about what their job is in a chord and how they work with the other parts, and learning to enjoy that dissonance.
Yeah, that's really good, and gives me an opportunity also just to plug the concept of teaching audiation in general, because if I, in any style of singing, because if I can't hear an A flat while a G is sounding really loudly next to me, then it doesn't. None of those things matter. And I think the one thing that I'm interested in hearing your take too on is, let's say I'm back in my choir of 100, and we're trying to do a David von Kampen jazz piece. Okay, and what would you talk to them about in terms of the way we sing it? Should the vocal production be different? Are there things that we should think about, learn about, that maybe we would take our vocal technique in one of my advanced groups that maybe they've been drummed into as a traditional choral program, and then I say, okay, now we're going to try this jazz piece. In what ways do we need to think about our singing differently?
Yeah.
Or not at
So,
all? I don't know.
well, okay. I sort of speak on this issue as kind of a layperson. There are other vocal jazz educators. I'm thinking about people like Justin Binnick, Jennifer Barnes, Jeremy Fox, who could answer this with much more sort of research and knowledge behind it. But my understanding and the way I talk to my choirs about this is, when you sing jazz, nothing about healthy singing changes from the way you sing in a concert choir. The way you breathe, the way you support your sound, you breathe from down low, you don't want tension up in your neck and your shoulders. None of that is different. The difference is literally the shape of your mouth and the way the sound comes out, because we can't have lots of big, robust individual tones and vibrato going on, or those tight jazz sonorities are not going to speak well. And so singing with, we sometimes think of it in jazz as a more youthful tone, singing through a smile, having a wider vowel concept, and then just listening and imitating the way vocal jazz groups sing. If you play a recording of Take Six or New York Voices, or the Four Freshmen or the Beach Boys are also singing that way, and just imitating that, and then you're not trying to do anything unhealthy, but it is a different style, and I think the stylistic changes come more out of the top.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, what is your take on, sometimes I hear, and this is, in my view, when I hear a not amazing, like, say, high school jazz group, it ends up coming out as just breathy. And I think sometimes that's taught to kids, but then I listen exactly what your suggestion was: listen to New York Voices. It's not breathy.
It's not breathy.
And so, is that something that you ever come across, and how do you address it if you do? Discover the world's largest selection of sheet music and an incredible catalog at sheetmusicplus.com. All summer long, they are running a back-to-school sale, 10% off of nearly everything that you might need for your class. And there are discounts year-round, so 5% off of any title when you buy 2 or more copies, and everyday band and orchestra and choir materials. You can set up your school with a school account, which are free, and then they get free shipping on larger orders. It's a really great place to have in your rotation, your go-to spots to find the music that you need for your classroom.
Yes, the breathiness, I think, is and should be a tool that kind of exists on a spectrum for a jazz group. There are
For sure.
there are times I say to my jazz choir, okay, on this chord, I want 2% more breathiness in the tone.
Uh-huh.
And I think about one of the classic vocal jazz arrangements by by Gene Perling for Manhattan Transfer, and Nightingale sang in Berkeley Square. Many of your listeners have probably heard the famous Manhattan Transfer recording of that. For most of that chart, they sing with a very clear, pure tone in each of the four voices. And then there's one moment towards the end where they kind of echo a line they just sang, and all of a sudden it gets super breathy. And you can tell that's not their default tone. That's not their business as usual tone, but they're choosing to do that in a specific moment for the timbral effect of it. And so I think that can be done really effectively. But yeah, we need to be careful with, especially with younger groups, that we don't just make breathiness the default tone as if that is somehow like more inherently jazzy than other things. You can and should create really smooth, beautiful blended tone with more or less the same timbre you use in, like, I don't know, if you're singing an Eric Whitacre piece, right? Those chords need to blend
right?
the same way.
Yeah. Now you might choose different vowels with an Eric Whitacre piece.
Yes, absolutely.
But all the other things, I like how you described it from the kind of the core of the body up. Everything is the same until you get to the
Yep.
resonating cavity, which is going to be essentially different. And
Yeah.
and this is why I think this topic is interesting and helpful for teachers, because you mentioned the default being breathy. We don't want to have that be the assumption. For young singers, adolescent singers that have never sung before, default is already breathy. Like
Right.
and that's one of the things that we're trying to help them fix, which is one of my concerns in my program with the idea. If I were to get the magical principal who said, sure, we can dedicate a teacher to this section for 12 kids, and we're going to
Mhm.
also buy you all the equipment and all that kind of stuff, and you can have a jazz choir. I would still want to caution folks, and I want to see, it's okay to disagree with this, but this would need to be a more advanced group. I would want to put 12 kids who have already learned how to get their vocal folds to touch, because
Yes.
the typical kid who comes into my class, they don't know how to do that.
Right.
And so, and saying, okay, now we're going to do this jazz style, which has all these different types of timbres that maybe are less common in choral music. I would want to start them with the basics as I see them, I guess, and then if once the ones that have a little bit more of that vocal mastery would get to do that jazz ensemble. Thoughts about that as a template?
I think because of the demands of the harmonic language, vocal jazz ensembles are often best slotted in a choral program or in a jazz program as a select group where you are trying to put your very best musicians in the group. It also has a really strong teaching element, and there are a lot of high schools, not so many here in Nebraska. We can talk about that. But in neighboring states, I see schools that have 3, 4, 5 vocal jazz ensembles, and the best one is their very best singing musicians in the school. And the lowest one might be freshmen who've never done it before. And there is a lot of kind of entry level literature where you can start them on music that is significantly easier to sort of accommodate a lot of rehearsal time for teaching the basic techniques the way you describe them. And
Mm-hmm.
again, because jazz is an oral language, and all jazz, instrumental from the very beginning, has been passed down through listening and imitating, not through musical notation. That is both something that makes it, I think, fun and exciting for students, and also maybe more easily graspable than if you're putting a student in your concert choir and they've got this octavo of sheet music and maybe they don't know how to read music very well. If you're in jazz choir, they're going to have to read music, but you're also going to play them a recording of the chart you're singing and say, listen and imitate, and maybe here's a part track that has your part. That kind of thing is not cheating in jazz. We encourage listening and imitating. And so, yes, both. It can and should be a select ensemble that's done at the very highest level, and it's also something that I think we can and should offer to any student that's interested in it, because of the tremendous benefits it gives you in terms of musicianship, ear training, and also just diversity of style. I mean, when we look at the composers of jazz literature, maybe not the arrangers so much of contemporary charts, but I mean, going back when we're arranging jazz music, you are experiencing uniquely American music that has been composed by all sorts of different people. And so when we think about things like wanting to expose our choral students to a diversity of music, you'd be hard pressed to look at a better genre than jazz.
Yeah, yeah, that's great, and I agree. And I think I'm going to throw you another dumb softball question. You ready? It's
I'm
kind of
I'm ready.
related to what you were talking about. So, if what you say is true, which is that jazz has its traditions in the ear and not in the notation. And why do you write down your jazz charts?
uh, because that is the most effective way to communicate complex harmony to a group. It can be done. It can be done by ear with recordings and part tracks. I think about ensembles in the vocal jazz world. I don't think take six works from notation very much, but that process can take a much longer time if you are teaching everything by rote and with tracks, and you also have to have arrangements that are sort of built up that way. So I think you could do jazz very authentically just from listening and from learning and arranging kind of by rote. But I would think it would take a very uniquely gifted educator to make that approach work. And there is an art to sort of using the score as a way to organize the arrangement, but not being beholden to the score in kind of a mechanical way of reproducing the code on the page. Just like with any music that is notated, a good conductor, a good director is going to talk about getting the music off the page. Otherwise, we would just listen to finale playback of every piece that's been written, and we would be moved by the music. Of course, that doesn't happen. The humanity of rehearsing and creating that music is what sort of lifts it off the page. And certainly, if I want a group to sing an arrangement that I'm writing, the very fastest way to get that information to them is in a notated score. But I hope they go far beyond that.
Right, and the way I like to think of it, and again, this I think transcends the style of music that I'm putting in front of my students, but I like to think of it as using those recordings and imitating, especially for young singers who are still learning how their voice works, and I think that's where I always like to bring it back. Ultimately, is I use those recordings to show them how to sing it, and I try to avoid using the recordings to show them what to sing. Because those are two different things. So, for example, if one of my educational goals is, because again, keeping in mind I teach high school students, if one of my educational goals is to teach them how to read music, then I want to make sure that they have the skills to decipher those harmonies on their own without my help. Eventually, that's
Right.
the goal. But
Mhm.
then, if I'm going to have them try to sing a vocal jazz piece in something approaching an authentic jazz style, I would want to use those recordings to help them understand how it should be sung in their own voice. As a choir teacher, I can't demonstrate the way a soprano should sing it, and I can't demonstrate authentically the way an alto can sing it. I can help the guys a little bit better. Those types of things. And so, what are thoughts about that framework from an education standpoint? Are you a director new to the profession? Or are you a seasoned director who is in a new place? One of my favorite tips for generating interest in the program and to instill buy-in is to plan a trip. There are so many options. You can go to Orlando, you can go to Ireland, or you can perform in a parade or a theme park. You can even take the stage at Carnegie Hall in New York. Wherever you end up, not only will your current crew look forward to the trip, but younger students will count the days until it's their turn to go. If you have no idea where to start, connect with Kaleidoscope Adventures at mykatrip.com.
Nothing is more important than listening. And this is, I mean, my excitement about ear training as an academic class comes from this same place. Like, music is not made to be looked at. It's meant to be listened to. It is content for your ears. And so when I think about the way composers need to imagine music that they're going to then write down to communicate to performers, you're not just imagining like the combination of those pitches and rhythms in a vacuum. You're imagining humans playing them. If I write choral music that a choir is going to sing, it's one skill that lets me write down specific notes and know what that chord is going to be in terms of like its musical structure. And it's a completely different experience that allows me to imagine what it's going to sound like if Voces 8 sings that chord. And one of those things you get from listening in a very sort of generic way, thinking about the relationships between notes and how chords are constructed. And the other one comes from listening in a very broad, creative way, in an enjoyable way, the way we listen to music because we love the sounds it makes. So yes, all of that. We need to build up our ears in terms of the theoretical language of the way music is kind of put together, And then we also want to listen broadly to expose our ears to different sounds and what different ensembles can do with those materials.
Yeah, yeah, and it's actually funny because one of probably the one thing that I'm the most choir famous for is being the sight reading evangelist, and
Ooh.
and I think that that is one of the most common misunderstandings that I come across is that when you say, and this is not a disagreement with what you just said per se, but you mentioned that that music is designed to be heard and listened to, not looked at.
Yeah.
And the one of the things that I like to help people understand is that when you are teaching someone to be an incredibly quick and efficient music reader, what you're actually teaching them to do is look at music and hear it.
Yes.
That's so it is the ear, and it drives me nuts. I think when I hear people talk about it like it's either the ear or the eye, and I'm like, no, you can't read any language. You can't read
Right,
English.
right. And what's the point of any literacy except to get beyond the thing that you are looking at because you are literate?
Yes, it is simply a way, and this is why my dumb softball question that I gave you before: why write down your scores? It's writing things down was nothing more thousands of years ago than a technological invention to store information.
Yeah.
That's all it ever was, and that's all it is now. So when we look at symbols written down, we want students to be able to hear all the things you just described. And so, for example, if I take a piece of choral music and I put it in front of them, I want them to be able to have some sense of being able to hear music happening in their head. And then I think as they get more advanced, I love the example you gave earlier. It's like, okay, now see if you can hear voce eight singing it. What would they sound like singing it? Because then you're really getting into that advanced level of audiation where not only can I hear notes and rhythms happening, I can hear timbres happening, I can hear dynamics happening, I can hear vocal color, I can hear the difference between a French horn and a saxophone. All of those types of things are skills that we can develop in our inner ear. That I think jazz harmony is uniquely interesting to me in terms of how it teaches kids to hear those shifting tonality changes. So that's my, I guess, expert little transition of our conversation into some of the theoretical concepts that
Yeah.
you also are very passionate about. And you teach theory as well, and in addition to the other things that you teach. Where I'm assuming you're kind of a nerd about that stuff. Where did that come from?
Yeah, I think pianists have sort of a big head start on music theory just because anyone who takes piano lessons uh, or even just plays like messes around to the piano. If you play
Yeah.
piano like by ear and just sort of figure things out on your own and you don't really know what anything is called, I would argue even those people have like a they've been shoved out of the gate in the music theory race because there's nothing like the piano for seeing the way the pitches are laid out in an orderly way and being able to produce multiple notes at once. You can play chords on other instruments, you can outline chords on most instruments, but there's nothing quite so easy as sitting down at the piano and saying plop, that's C major, these are the notes, this is what it looks like, this is what it feels like under my hand, this is what it sounds like. And so when we think about music theory, at least insofar as you're defining music theory largely in terms of harmony, which is a somewhat narrow way of thinking about it, music theory describes what happens in music. That includes any music. Every music that exists has a music theory behind it, if you want to dive into that. But in our part of the world, historically, over the last however many years, and this is changing too, but recently, like hundreds recently-ish, we put a lot of focus on harmony in music theory, chords and melodies and voice leading and the way chords connect to each other. And so that is something that pianists, I think, have a relatively intuitive understanding of, and composer pianists have an even more intuitive understanding of it because the composer's job is to think about how musical events, whether they are chords or single pitches or rhythms, are working horizontally across time. And so for composers that are excited about chords, like I am, like I was when I learned piano and played by ear a lot, uh, getting into music theory was a very natural outgrowth of that for me because it just took that creative process and took one tiny step back and said, what's really going on there? How did that happen?
Yeah.
Hearing something you love and saying, man, I'd love to know how they made that happen. And so my journey with ear training, I guess, and playing by ear and learning music that I enjoyed listening to, figuring out how to play it on the piano, that led very directly to, if not a passion for teaching music theory directly, it led to the skills that are required to do that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I was digging around on your website right before we talked, and I found you have some slides presentations that I looked through and read through, which are awesome.
You
By the
dug
way, I think
deep. That's
yeah,
buried in the blog.
yeah, oh yeah, I do my research, and I also think you might have just written my curriculum for my music appreciation class for first semester, so I don't have to do any work now, which
Go
is
for
great.
it.
I'm going to give them a bunch of your slides, and I'm going to give them a bunch of 3 minute theory, and it's going to be I will have to do like no work at all. It's going to be great. But that's not the one I wanted to ask about. You have a slide in there about teaching music theory, and there was a quote that I wanted to pull out and just use that as a discussion point here because I found it to be interesting and multi-layered. The quote was, "The purpose of music theory is to describe what happens in music. That's it." And then you went on to say that it is descriptive, not prescriptive. Now, why is that important information enough for you to put it in one of your slides presentations?
Yeah, so the descriptive prescriptive quote, I don't know if I attributed it or not, but that came from a Adam Neely video on YouTube that was going around a number of years ago, where he did kind of a really nice medium dive into what the purpose of music theory is and why musicians. He's talking specifically mostly to like pop and jazz musicians, saying, why this is important for you, why this is something you don't need to ignore. The idea that music theory describes what happens in music resonates with me because I believe that is a strong response to musicians who say, I'm not interested in music theory. I don't need music theory. I can make music without knowing music theory. Uh, all those things are true. We have tons of examples now and throughout history of incredible musicians who didn't know music theory per se. But my argument would be that they actually did know it because I think you can know a lot of music theory without knowing the names and labels of everything. The theory is the event, the knowledge of the event of what's happening. And so when I encounter students who are either scared of music theory, they're coming in as a music major. I teach the freshmen, so I get them right away. And somebody says, I love music, I love to perform, but I'm really worried about doing well in theory. My response to them is, well, if you love music, I'm going to make you love music theory because all we're doing in music theory is figuring out how music works. The thing you like has a recipe behind it, has logic to it, has the imagination of a composer behind it. And we are going to dive into what happens in those musical events and how they work the way they do. Um, and that's kind of why I like describing it that way, to say that music theory is describing what happens in music, and that's kind of where I like to start.
Yeah. Another question that comes to my mind about that idea is the descriptive, not prescriptive part needs to be said, but I wonder what your take is on why it needs to be said. Why is there this idea that music theory is really just a set of rules that you have to
Right.
follow? Where does that
Right.
idea come from?
Well, we as music theory teachers don't always do as strong of a job as we should explaining what we mean by rules. So in music theory, we teach uh, the way music was written at a certain time, often with the chorales of Bach and other composers around that time, and we sort of pull those apart and say, uh, how do we write voice leading the way these chorales do, and how do we construct chords the way these chorales do? And I think that's super valuable. I think most composers and most music students should have a good understanding of like traditional harmony and traditional voice leading. But that's just one tool and one style among many styles of music. And if the music you're interested in doesn't use chords that way, then the music theory you immerse yourself in might not deal with that type of part writing so much. So we teach part writing and other parts of music theory by way of saying, all right, we're gonna create some music that sort of acts in this way, and here are the rules you need to follow. Here are the things you shouldn't do. But you could just as easily start from the other end and say, let's find sort of the joy of this music and sort of try to recreate it intuitively without worrying about what not to do, but by focusing on what you should do. And that sometimes takes more time because you need to really absorb a musical style very deeply before that is a useful way to do it. But in a perfect world, yeah, we would approach teaching all these things from a place of positivity. How do you do it? Not negativity. Here's XYZ you cannot do.
Right. Yeah, I want to go back actually to something you said where teachers of theory sometimes don't do a good enough job explaining what rules mean. Like, what does it mean to be a rule? Um, and you use the Bach chorale example for voice leading. So I want to drill in on that a little bit. So it sounds like what you're saying is that it's good to teach the voice leading concepts that you can find in a Bach chorale, but it's important to go the next step and not just talk about how these are the rules because Bach did it. These are the rules because they work well for singers who are trying to read music, and it's easier to go from mi to fa than it is to go from mi down a seventh and then try to find, fa down there and like all this kind of stuff, right? So there are reasons that those voice leading concepts are effective, and that if you're going to break the rule, here's what you might encounter as a problem. Is that kind of what you're getting at? As like this is how we should be approaching these concepts, and rather than rules, they're like guidelines to avoid problems?
Yes. Yes, you're saying it perfectly. It's interesting to me that we use Bach chorales as an example of good voice leading, and good voice leading is meant to make it easier to sing because often that music is not easy to sing.
Right.
That there's an interesting paradox there. But I think of kind of the hymnal style of chorales as another really important teaching point in conjunction with kind of the more florid Bach style with all those non-chord tones. If you just open a Methodist hymnal or Lutheran hymnal or whatever, you get chord, 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 and you can experience that voice leading in a much more accessible way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think you said it exactly right. The reason voice leading is important is because in most styles of traditional harmony, chordal music, we want the individual lines, the individual parts to be singable and to have like an interesting melody. And if you are composing in a way where you're prioritizing the vertical chords and not thinking at all horizontally, then the chords might be cool one at a time, but your tenors are going to have an awful time getting from one note to the next. And so thinking about voice leading as a horizontal activity musically, and each part as its own melody is really the basis of a lot of those part writing rules. And again, just this idea that to go back to the descriptive prescriptive thing,
Mm-hmm.
there is a big misconception that music theory is the rules you need to follow to create music, and that just could not be less true. Again, music theory being prescriptive, that's because music theory describes what happens in music. The composers can do whatever they want. We have plenty of examples of composers writing music that doesn't follow whatever rule book you wanna look at in whatever style of music theory. So the music, the creative act comes from an intuitive place in the composer's brain, and then music theory is what we do after the fact when we look at that music and say, here's how they did it, here's what happens in this music, and we're going to kind of dissect it and figure out what makes it effective, but that's not the composer's thought.
Right. Yeah, I'm hearing interesting parallels for music theory. I don't know if you've ever thought of it this way or what you think about this analogy, but it sounds to me like we could think about music theory instruction as teaching musicians the science language of music. Meaning, for example, if I'm going to do a study in chemistry, if I'm going to actually go through the rigorous steps of creating, doing some type of a scientific study in chemistry, it is my job to simply describe what happens when you mix, boron with radium. I'm just making up things. I'm not a scientist. But it's my job to describe what happens when those things are combined in certain quantities, under certain temperatures or pressures or whatever it is that you might do in a chemistry lab experiment. It's not my job to say what should have happened.
Right.
What really
Or
should have
to
happened is they should have exploded, and they didn't. It's
or
my
to
job to simply,
describe
yeah,
or to describe how the result makes you feel.
yes, right, or how it should make you feel.
Yeah. Right.
Right, and so I think that's where the intersection with music theory and art, I think, can be really, really important. Is if the theorist understands that their job is to simply report from the sidelines, almost of like, this is what is happening. Thoughts about that?
Yeah, and also just to sort of figure out how this magic happens, because the end result, the music itself, is something that is very hard to describe in like scientific terms. It has a qualitative value that is more than the sum of its parts. But I think how, if you're getting a music degree in film studies, if you want to be involved in making movies, you've got to get under the hood about a lot of things and figure out how things work so that you can create that more sort of emotional end experience.
Yeah, yeah, and in a lot of ways, that leaves the realm of a theorist. In certain senses, like I can't, wearing my music theory hat, I can't describe how it made you feel.
Right.
And I also can't prescribe how the next audience member who hears that same exact piece of music might also feel. And I think that's my favorite part about being an artist. Actually, is I don't. In fact, when I do a concert, when I conduct a concert, and there's that moment of people wanting to talk to me after the concert, and everybody wants to come up and shake my hand and all that kind of thing, which is great. My question is always the same, and I've been doing this for years. What was your favorite thing?
Yeah.
And I ask that of any audience member who wants to talk to me. What was your favorite thing? And I don't care if they're 5 years old or 80 years old. And it's amazing to me how the answers are just always different. And they're typically not the things that I would predict as being what was my favorite thing. And I don't see any way to have music theory explain that.
No, I don't think so. But what music theory can do is give a student the tools to learn how to put the music in position to do that for someone.
Sure. Under what conditions are you most likely to get a certain type of response?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And that's no different than the theory of how painters like study color and the way colors interact with each other. And it can't prescribe a feeling to someone, but it can put your painting in a better situation to get those types of responses.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. So let's shift a little bit to one more area, which of course is the place that all of this intersects in your life, which is writing music for choirs and jazz groups and those types of things. Tell us a little bit about how that process works for you. Where do you get your inspiration? What makes you decide what you're going to write?
Wow, man, that's a big question. I gravitate away from the word inspiration. I think that word suggests something very sort of flowery and sparkly and magical that is not really how I think of my job as a composer. Almost everything I write now starts with someone needing something, which is great. Because almost every time I sit down to write something now, I have a specific ensemble in mind, a specific occasion. Working on commissions or writing for my own groups that I direct is a wonderful motivator for getting things done quickly, writing music that doesn't just satisfy kind of my, whatever I want to try out, but has a very specific goal and parameters, and being able to create something that's very effective within the parameters of what the ensemble or the person who's asking for it needs. That is what drives me, is actually getting the music out into the world where it can be performed and heard. Because I enjoy the composing process, but I see that as a means to an end, and the end is the actual making of the music in a public setting or for a recording, and that's where the magic happens. No one wants to watch a composer write the notes down or watch a composer sort of thinking and imagining the music in their head. We want to hear the music happening in real life. So getting the music out of my basement where I'm sitting right now, where I do the composing, and into the hands of the people who are going to perform it is the main inspiration for me. And the prospect of having something that I've written be sung or played really well is there's nothing more inspiring than that. There's nothing that makes you want to get to work and write something great more than that.
Yeah.
Because when they do it, that's where the magic is going to happen.
Now, you're one of those composers that has music published in a variety of places. But GIA Walton is going to help us spread the word about this episode. So let's start there. What are some of your
Yeah.
favorite things that people should know about? And if you have any stories about those pieces in your Walton catalog.
Yeah, I'm relatively new to Walton. I think I have 4 pieces with them right now. The first one that they published of mine from, I want to say 4 or 5 years ago, is called "Flood the Gold Earth," which is a piece I'm really proud of. Has a really busy, active piano part, and the whole thing is very kind of flittery and exciting, based on a George MacDonald poem. A big ending for the choir. I really like how that piece turned out. I have a piece Walton published called "I Am Possibility" from, it was published in either late 2020 or early 2021. I wrote the piece about 2 weeks before the COVID lockdowns.
Oh, wow.
And that piece has a poem by my friend Becky Boson is the text for that piece. We collaborated on it. And it has a really just warm, open message of positivity, which I wasn't really thinking about at the time how resonant that was going to be. But I like how that piece turned out. That one is a little more accessible probably to a younger group than "Flood the Gold Earth." And then I have a Christmas piece with Walton, Christina Rossetti poem "Love Came Down at Christmas." That was probably actually the first one they published. The biggest thing I've done with GIA lately is the book I published, the Music Theory Modern Musician's Guide. What do we end up calling it? The Modern Musician's Guide to Music Theory and Composition. We published that last summer through GIA, so that's there also.
Well, is that like a textbook?
Good question. It is. It could be used as a textbook, but it is not a comprehensive textbook. It's more like a series of really approachable essays about sort of how I think about and teach various music theory topics. So we have a topic on voice leading, a topic on counterpoint, chapter on ear training, a chapter on chord construction, like how to make vertical chords sound great, chapters on pop song forms and how to listen better. So if you wanna get like the full undergraduate music theory sequence knowledge, this will not cover all of it. But this will address a lot of those topics and sort of try to streamline them and also explain why they're important to me.
Okay, that's really cool. Yeah, now I'm interested too in because I'm not a composer and I don't really know how it works, and other people listening might have this curiosity too. But as a composer, you're writing music, you've got these occasions for the different things, as you said, and that's a great place to be. How do you decide, or how is it decided, that this is going to be published by Walton, and this is going to be published by Graphite, and this is going to be published by Music Spoke or wherever else you can find your music? How does that work?
Well, every composer you talk to will give you a different answer to this question.
Yeah.
For me, I tend to write a lot. I generally work very quickly, and I pursue a lot of projects, and I have a lot of pieces that I would like to get published that are not yet, and things that are self-published. So the way I end up thinking about this is just sort of as I finish a piece, trying to figure out, number one, is this a piece that I'm going to like push hard out into the world and try to get other people interested in? Because I can't do that for every piece I write, and or the people I send emails to would get real sick of me. So knowing what publishers are interested in, knowing what kind of pieces I've had success with the self-publishing, is a important starting place. Generally for sort of like advanced, choral works that a college choir would want to do. If I finish something like that and I'm really excited about, I'll send it to Walton or Santa Barbara first. And there are other things that just don't fit quite so well with any publishers necessarily. I have some larger sacred works that are meant for like church choirs that are probably too much music, too many movements for a place like Concordia Publishing House, where I normally publish a lot of sacred music. So some of those extended sacred works fit really well at a place like Graphite or Music Spoke, where I can put up what I want, and it essentially functions as a store, as distribution. So I don't have to have a store on my website. But just kind of thinking about how different
Oh.
pieces would fit.
So when you put something on Graphite, you get to just decide. Like, that's going
More
up.
or less, yeah. I can only speak for Music Spoke and Graphite because those are the two kind of self-publishing places I'm a part of. But yes, for both of those websites, their policy with composers is once you are, accepted as a composer into this group, you can basically list whatever pieces you want to be
Oh,
sold.
that's great. I didn't realize that. That's very cool. All right, so I've got one more little set of questions for you, which is kind of a traditional ending of the conversation with composers whenever I speak with composers.
Love
So
it.
it's kind of a two-part question. What's a piece in your catalog, and it doesn't have to be Walton, it can be any place that we can find your music. What's a piece in your catalog that you wrote that you thought was going to go off really well, and then it didn't? And then on the other side of that equation, is there a piece that you really were like, this is not my best work, but for some reason people loved it? Do you have any music that fits into those categories where you thought your opinion of the piece was different than the audience's opinion?
That's a really interesting question. Um, I don't know if I'm going to have great answers to either of those because I feel like the pieces that I liked a lot that I might say haven't gone off that well is not that there was negative feedback necessarily, but just that it didn't take off in
That's
terms
what I
of,
mean.
yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
just people aren't singing
Just
it.
didn't, I would put Saturn's Embrace in that category. The piece we started off
Oh,
by talking
okay.
about. When I finished that, just kind of thinking about how it turned out and the way the music worked with the text and the fact that the text came from sort of a clever place, I sort of expected that to hit the ground running, and that's been slower. Not a lot of groups have taken on Saturn's Embrace, and I hope that changes.
Okay. All right. How about, do you have anything on the other side of that where you were like, I'm kind of surprised that that piece did so well?
That for me, that usually happens if I write something that that I do really quickly, something that I'm not taking super seriously at first. And I think that's certainly a testament to, composers shouldn't overthink their stuff. Don't get too self-important about it because the thing you dash off will be the thing you're known for.
Okay.
Um, I don't no examples come right to the top of my head. A piece like I Am Possibility for Walton, I was definitely thinking of as trying to make it very accessible and very quick. Not that I was at all unhappy with how it turned out or not proud of it, but I was thinking of that as kind of a quicker project that was meant to just sound really good really quickly, and that's done really well. So
Yeah.
that's I guess an example of that.
That's great. That's great. I love it. Well, David, or DVK, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much for spending an hour with me. What are you drinking back there, by the way?
Just sparkling water, just some orange thing.
Yeah, it's a little early in the day. Are you in Nebraska now?
Yes, I am in Lincoln.
Okay. All right. Great. Well, this was lots of fun. I appreciate you spending time with it, and I think that this is going to be a valuable conversation for folks, and I appreciate you joining me.
I hope so. I really enjoyed being here, and thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you, as always, for sticking around to the end of an episode. If you are still listening, that means you're one of the people who are MVPs of the Choralosophy podcast, the people who stick around to the end. Of course, the ways to help are to use the Choralosophy promo code at sightreadingfactory.com, mymusicfolders.com, 3minutetheory.com, endeavormusicpublishing.com, graphitepublishing.com, and of course you can join the Patreon. Link is in the show notes. You can also subscribe at Substack and chip in a few dollars a month there. All of those things are great ways to help, and of course like, share, leave comments, be part of the conversation. That's what this is all about. See you guys next time.